Happy Sabbath. It's good to be with you. So we are in third part of a series on relationships. And we have started this series with the premise that we are made for relationships. That God is love. If you're going to define God with one word, boil down who he is to one word, that word is love. And love is nonsensical outside of relationships. It can't actually even exist outside of relationships. And which means that God at his very core is a relational being. It's who he is. It's what drives him. And if we are made in his image, then we too are made for relationships. And I think we know this intrinsically because we have experienced that the quality of our relationships greatly impacts the quality of our lives, right? You can have a great job, lots of money, perfect health, and miserable relationships. Are you going to be a happy person? No. Our lives rise and fall on the quality of our relationships. The church, by the way, the ministry, the effectiveness of the church rises and falls on relationships. So we're going to pray, and today what we're going to talk about is generational dysfunction and trauma in relationships. So let's pray together. Lord God, thank you for who you are, that you're a God of love, that above all, that you want to have a relationship with us. And I pray that you would just take these words today, that they would be yours, that you would use them to heal our broken hearts and to make us more like yourself. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So the story of the Bible, in many ways, is the story of a family. Genesis 12, we're introduced to this family when God says to Abram, get out of Haran, leave your family that's there, and he's going to go to a new place. He's going to go to the promised land. And for the next several thousand years, we're going to follow this family around, right? And what God says to that family, what he says to Abram, he says, in you, in your family, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. I'm going to make your family, I'm going to bless your family and make your family a blessing. And indeed, can family be a tremendous blessing? Absolutely. When our family talks together and says, hey, what are you thankful for? What do you want to praise God for? What do you want to thank him for? One of the things that's usually at the very top of that list is family. It can be such a blessing. Except when it's not. And we have probably all experienced times when family can make us miserable, can bring tremendous pain and hurt into our lives. And the truth is, the family that God chose, through whom he was going to bring blessings to all the earth, that family, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, was an exceptionally dysfunctional family. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, whose names would be carried on down through the generations. People would claim their names as a badge. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are Exhibit A in the Museum of Family Dysfunction. And yet, their story, I believe, is ultimately a story of hope. In Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we see generational dysfunction. Dysfunction that is passed down from one generation to the next, over and over and over again. Let me just give you some very quick examples of how we see this generational dysfunction playing out in Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. First of all, we have 3 generations of marital unfaithfulness leading to division. You've got Abraham and the whole Hagar issue, which creates long-term conflict. Abram lies about his wife being his wife and says that she's his sister so that he can save his own skin and allow somebody else to be with her. Jacob ends up marrying 2 sisters plus their servants, so he's got 4 women, and there's just this pattern over and over and over again of marital unfaithfulness leading to division. You also have 3 generations of deception and manipulation. Abram, to save his own skin, lies twice and says, oh, that's actually not my wife, that's my sister. And then do you know what Isaac does? The exact same thing. Jacob, his name becomes synonymous with deception and manipulation, right? He is the supplanter. He's the deceiver. He seeks to get what he desires through deceit and through manipulation. And his children do the same. We see these generations of deception and manipulation, lying and deceiving and manipulating for their own benefit, irregardless of how it will hurt someone else. Just imagine your husband disowns you as his wife and says you are his sister so that he can save his own skin, but doesn't care about what that means for you and the consequences. You should be mad at your husband if he does that to you. You've got 3 generations of favoritism leading to sibling envy, rivalry, and hatred. Abram has got a favorite son. So does Isaac, and so does Jacob. And not only do they have favorite sons, they've got favorite wives of their numerous wives. And this favoritism causes there to be this intense sibling rivalry that ultimately ends in hatred. Imagine being a part of a family where you feel like you have to compete with your own siblings in order to earn favor and approval from your parents. And ultimately, we see 3 generations of conflict avoidance and mismanagement. They don't have the hard conversations that they need to have. They pretend like problems aren't there. They allow things to continue and brew until they explode and boil over. They don't confront sin. Their silence becomes normal. There's 3 generations of conflict avoidance and mismanagement. And what's very interesting, in Exodus, when God is there with Moses on the mountain, and Moses asks to see God, and God is going to show not his physical attributes, but his characteristics, his character to Moses. He says, I'm the God who has forgiveness and mercy for 1,000 generations, which, by the way, is more than all the generations that we see in the entire Bible. But he does say, bringing the consequences of the father's iniquity on the children and grandchildren to the 3rd and 4th generation. Now, what does this mean when God says the consequences of the fathers and the grandfathers fall on the children to the 3rd and the 4th generations? Is this saying that God is holding grandchildren guilty for their grandparents' sins? No. It's not what it's saying at all. In fact, God makes that very clear in Ezekiel 18 and other places. What this is saying is the guilt of sin is not passed down from one generation to the next, but the consequences of sin are. The consequences of sin, the dysfunction, the trauma are handed down from one generation to the next. And we see this In this family that God sets aside to bless them and make them a blessing to all the families of the earth, that even in that family that he begins with, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we see a very clear line how Abraham's dysfunction is passed down to Isaac and passed down to Jacob and passed down to Jacob's sons. Down through the generations. The consequences of their sin and their dysfunction are passed down. Now, we are no different. We are not guilty for the sin of our parents and the sin of our grandparents, but we are also not unaffected by their sin and their dysfunction. There's a quote by Peter Scazzero, pastor and author, that I think is so true. It says, Jesus may be in your heart, but grandpa is in your bones. And the task of discipleship is to get Jesus more into your bones. When you become a believer in Jesus, when you become baptized, God does not turn some switch up in heaven and snap his finger and take away automatically all the consequences of the generations of dysfunction and trauma in your family. It doesn't disappear. And if we pretend like it doesn't affect us, we can't deal with it. Jesus may be in your heart, but grandpa is in your bones. And one of the reasons sometimes we fail to realize this is because the way that grandpa's dysfunction is passed down isn't always a direct line to dysfunction in my life. We can see a direct narrative between Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We can see the same exact sins repeating, the same dysfunctions repeating from one generation to the next. But that's not how it always works. Trauma doesn't always appear in the same form. Addiction and dysfunction and abuse don't always appear in the same form in the next generations. So abuse in one generation could be emotional distance or harshness in another. Neglect in one generation could be people-pleasing or anxiety in the next generation. Addiction in one generation could be perfectionism and control in the next generation. And just because it doesn't look exactly the same as grandpa doesn't mean he's not in your bones. And this is a reality that we all have to deal with. This is part of the insidiousness of sin, the power of sin, is that there's like an infection that is passed on down. There's a power that is passed on down from one generation to the next. Peter Scazzero goes on to say, it's impossible to be spiritually mature while remaining emotionally immature. And I have to say, this is something I have seen repeatedly as a pastor. You can have someone who is theologically robust and mature, who can articulate spiritual things, who has strong spiritual convictions, but when it comes to emotional maturity, they're like a toddler. And you know what happens? They cause a lot of damage in their family and in their church and in their world. And just because we can articulate spiritual truth in a clear way does not mean that we are spiritually mature, because if that truth does not translate into a changing of my heart, what good is it? Is it really maturity after all? And so spiritual maturity means that the truth of Jesus, the words of Jesus have to change who we are, and a huge part of who we are is our emotional lives. It's impossible to be spiritually mature while remaining emotionally immature. Some of you have been reading These books, they're good. I would encourage you to pick these up. Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. This is a later book, Emotionally Healthy Discipleship. They're both really good. If you're just going to choose one, I would probably choose this one. But they're both excellent. We can't just ignore these things. We can't just ignore them. And I believe that God has a way to stop the generational dysfunction. God has a plan. God is willing and ready to work in our lives. I mean, we inherit these things, but do we really want our children and our grandchildren to inherit them? Do we really want to keep passing on to the next generation these dysfunctions? This is where I love the story of Joseph. Because you have in Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob very clear, repeated patterns of dysfunction. But then when we get to Joseph, when we get to that fourth generation, the story takes a turn. Joseph and his life and his experience is a beacon of hope that there can be a transition, that there can be a transitional generation that can change the course, that God can redeem even the dysfunctions in our family. So let's dive in to this story of Joseph. And let's be very clear that the story of Joseph starts with him reaping the consequences of generational dysfunction. There's not some immaculate conception where God is going to just snap his fingers and all that dysfunction in the past is just not going to be passed on, and that's how the transition is going to happen. The story of Joseph starts with him reaping all the consequences. Just think about it. We see that Joseph is the favorite son, right? And he knows it. He knows it, and when he goes to check on his brothers and brings word back to his father. Do you remember what Genesis says? What kind of report he's happy to bring back? He brings back a bad report against his brother. Why is Joseph so eager to bring back a bad report to his father? Because Joseph is the favorite son, and he knows it, and he is a part of that whole system. He plays into it. He wants to be the favorite. He is reinforcing his role in this generational dysfunction. So he brings back the bad report, right? Has the dream, stars bowing down, and he's gleeful to share this dream. Why? Because his role in this generational dysfunction, he's playing the part. And then he goes out to see his brothers. And just think about how the story has progressed through the generations and the pinnacle of dysfunction that is reached in the story of Joseph. He's going out to see his brothers, and they're fed up with dad liking him more. He's got the coat. He's had the dreams. He gets all the favoritism. What about us? And so here comes the dreamer. They throw their own brother in a pit. And while he's there in the pit, imagine, they're having a debate with one another. Well, should we kill him or should we sell him as a slave? That's pretty dysfunctional. Their dysfunction has reached such a point that they are willing, contemplating killing their own sibling and decide, oh, well, we'll be nice and we'll just sell him as a slave. Imagine you're Joseph there in that pit, and you're hearing the arguments from your own family, your older siblings who are supposed to be your protectors and mentors, and they're debating, well, is it worth killing him? Let's just sell him. That is trauma. I mean, can you imagine the trauma? 17 years old. So he's sold as a slave. And notice how the dysfunction is brought back to the family. They bring the coat. Remember, they put the blood on it. Bring it back to Jacob. Is this the coat of your son? We found this. The deception, the manipulation. And Jacob begins, his heart is just broken. He begins weeping. And notice what happens here. Genesis 37. And all his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him. But he refused to be comforted, and he said, "For I shall go down into the grave to my son in mourning." Thus his father wept for him. Just think about this. Do they really care about comforting Jacob? They have lied to him. They know exactly where his son is and that his son is not dead, but they keep playing into that deception and that manipulation, and they're comforting him when they are the ones who have put that knife in him and are twisting it. That is dysfunction. So we know the story. Joseph is carried down to Egypt. And we know how the story ends, right? We've heard this from the time probably that we were young. We know that the trajectory is that even though he's going down to Egypt as a slave, he's going to be a prisoner, that one day he's going to be second in command, that there's good ending at the end of all of it. But Joseph doesn't know any of that. And he is taken to a foreign country where he doesn't speak the language, where he's outside of his culture. His family isn't there, and they've betrayed him. They're the ones who sold him into slavery. What was going on in his mind and his heart during this time? And we don't know. We're not told. But if the devil was alive then, and if Joseph was a human, don't you think he was being tempted to bitterness and rage and anger? To anger at his brothers. And allowing that anger and betrayal to harden his heart toward them. To harden his heart toward God. Why'd you give me those dreams? Just for this to happen. If the devil was alive and Joseph was a human, I know he was tempted in that way. And yet, this is how the story frames it. Now, Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, brought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. The Lord was with Joseph. Which to me is pretty amazing, because I believe that this account of Joseph's story is passed on down to the next generations by Joseph himself. Who else was there in Potiphar's house to pass on the story? Joseph himself is the one who retells this story to the next generations, which means when he tells the story to the next generations, he says, I was sold by my brothers, went down to Egypt as a slave, and God was with me. So many times in life, when we experience pain and trauma, maybe even abuse, a natural question that we ask is, God, where were you? How could you be love and stand by in silence and do nothing while this happened to me? Where were you? It's a fair question, isn't it? And so often we don't know why God allows the things that he allows. We don't know why things happen. It doesn't make sense. How can he be all loving and all powerful and so silent? And yet, Joseph had all of those same questions, and he clung to God. He clung to God when he didn't have answers, when it did not make sense, when God and his family and everyone else seemingly has betrayed him. Joseph clung to God and believed that God was with him, despite all that he went through. And I believe that this act of faith, this holding on to God, even when it hurts and when God seems distant and silent, is what allows Joseph's story to turn. If he had hardened off his heart toward his family and toward God because of the betrayal, because of the anger and the rage, and just given into those feelings, I don't think the story would have turned out the way that it did. He clings to God. So he's there in Potiphar's house. God blesses him with increasing responsibility. And what's really interesting is that there's this interlude in the story of Joseph in Genesis. So we've got, the story of him being thrown into the pit and going down to Potiphar's house, but there's this intermission, this chapter that's inserted here in Genesis, where we go back to the promised land, and all of a sudden we're not talking about Joseph anymore, we're talking about Judah. And there's this whole ordeal between Judah and Tamar. And what we see is that generational dysfunction, that marital unfaithfulness from Abraham and Jacob has been passed down into Judah. And Judah, it's a terrible story. We can't even read that story here together in mixed company. It's a terrible story. And Judah does not care who he hurts and how he hurts them. And then the very next story is the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife. There's a contrast here. Joseph has every reason to think of himself as the victim. He's a slave. His master's wife comes to him and bids him. He's not in charge of himself. He's been betrayed by family who have given him this example of marital unfaithfulness down through the generation. He has every reason to say, well, why not? He's got every reason to make excuses and to continue the dysfunction and the sinfulness that has been handed down to him throughout the generations. And yet, he says to Potiphar's wife, how then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And here we can see this clinging to God, right? He doesn't know why God led him into slavery, but he's clinging to God and refuses to allow the trauma and situation and dysfunction that has been handed down to him by life. He refuses to allow that to be an excuse and takes responsibility for his own actions. He does not see his history as his destiny. He can choose a different course. So Joseph clung to God, and Joseph did not use his circumstances as an excuse to perpetuate dysfunction. He did not see his circumstances as an excuse. Takes responsibility. And of course, his faithfulness gets him thrown into prison. I don't know what that prison was like. It seems like it's probably some sort of political prison. And Joseph must have had some favor with Potiphar, because I think if he didn't, he would have just been killed. But that prison has to be bad enough, at least, that it's punishment for slaves. That it's got to be worse than a life of slavery, right? So he's there. He's in prison where he's going to rot for years, decades. And when he tells the story to the next generation, what does he say? The Lord was with him. He's clinging to God. He's got every excuse to be bitter, to be angry, to harden off his heart, to wall it off from God and from people, to play over in his mind what he's going to do to his brothers if he ever gets the chance. But he doesn't. Clings to God. Believes that God is with him, even as he's rotting in prison with no hope of ever getting out. And we know what happens, right? The dreams he interprets, and eventually he interprets for Pharaoh himself. He's promoted to second in command in the kingdom. Always giving credit to God. Always giving honor to God. And what's so remarkable about the story of Joseph is not so much what he does when he's a victim and when he's helpless. It's what he does when he is in power. That highlights God's transformation of his heart. Go with me to Genesis 45. Genesis 45. Joseph is probably the second most powerful man on earth. He can do whatever he wants with his brothers who've come there because of the famine. Maybe he has wondered many times in his mind, what will I do if I ever see my brothers again? And notice, he has tested them to see if their characters are changed, to see if they are the same people that sold him into slavery. There's some boundaries there. We don't really have time to talk about all of that. But notice Genesis 45, starting with verse 1. Then Joseph could not restrain himself. He sees that there's actually been a change in his brothers, right? He sees that that they are thinking about someone other than just themselves. And it gets to him. Joseph could not restrain himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, "Make everyone go out from me." So no one stood with him while Joseph made himself known to his brothers, and he wept aloud. And the Egyptians in the house of Pharaoh heard it. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Does my father still live?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed in his presence. And Joseph said to his brothers, "Please come near to me." So they came near. Then he said, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. But now, do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life." So notice what happens here. Joseph weeps. And actually, all throughout the narrative, he weeps. Over and over and over again, he weeps. Joseph is not just, bygones be bygones, we'll just forget about the past and move on. That's not what he does, right? He names the trauma. You sold me into slavery. Says it out loud and weeps and grieves. Lets his heart break. I don't know how many times he wept in prison, but there before his brothers, he names the trauma and he weeps. I believe two things are true about forgiveness. I believe you can't be forgiven for the sin you do not confess. right? You can't experience forgiveness for something that you refuse to acknowledge and confess and take responsibility and ownership for. But I also believe you can't forgive the sin you do not acknowledge. Pretending like it didn't happen, pretending like it didn't hurt, pretending like it wasn't a big deal is not forgiveness and will not release you or the person who hurts you. You have to acknowledge the sin and say, it hurt me, you sold me as a slave, in order to forgive the sin. So Joseph, he's grieving it, he's naming it so that it can be forgiven. So Joseph weeps and acknowledges the sin. He acknowledges the trauma. He faces it square on. Pretending like those things didn't happen or weren't a part of your family or your story doesn't make them go away. They will manifest themselves in other ways and other forms in your life. We have to acknowledge it in order to be able to move on and to be healed from it. And then ultimately, Joseph chooses to forgive. And we're not told what is going on inside of Joseph's mind and heart when he forgives. But I can't believe it was some euphoric feeling he felt in that moment. And he just said yes, he just gave in to this euphoric feeling that he wanted to forgive his brothers. I have to believe that if forgiveness in Joseph was anything like how forgiveness has worked in my life, that it was something he had to choose and surrender over and over and over again as he's rotting there in that prison cell. Not giving into the anger, not giving into the rage and the bitterness, and choosing to extend mercy. To say, I will release you and myself from this pain and this hatred and this need for revenge. He chooses. And I believe actually when he's there with his brothers, it's just a manifestation of choices that Joseph has been making for years. If he had been bitter and plotting all of those years in the prison cell, he would never have been able to, in the moment, in the heat and feeling of the moment, forgive his brothers. He died to self and made that surrender, made that sacrifice over and over and over again. And then finally, I want you to notice with me chapter 50. There's such hope in the way that the story of this dysfunctional family ends in the book of Genesis. Joseph's brothers and his father and their children and grandchildren have all been brought to Egypt. He has used his wealth and power to bless them, to provide for them, to take care of them. And now Jacob, who has gotten older in years, has passed away. And Joseph's brothers are concerned that Joseph's forgiveness, that his kindness toward them was all just a facade. That he didn't really mean it. And he was just doing it for the sake of honoring Jacob, his father. And now that Jacob is gone, Joseph is going to do to us what he's wanted to do to us all along. And so, notice Genesis 50, verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead. Now notice, this is their very first thought when dad is dead, right? You see the dysfunction? It's been passed down from generation. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, perhaps Joseph will hate us and may actually repay us for all the evil which we did to him. So they sent messengers to Joseph saying, before your father died, he commanded, saying, thus you shall say to Joseph, I beg you, please forgive the trespasses of your brothers and their sin, for they did evil to you. Notice they're appealing to dad, right? For their own safety, for their own protection. Now please forgive the trespasses of the servants of the God of your father. And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. I think this weeping is a little different than the other weeping that Joseph has done. Because I think that Joseph has truly had a change of heart. He has truly released them. But they don't trust him. And that wounds him. So he weeps. Then his brothers also went and fell down before his face, and they said, "Behold, we are your servants." Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive. Now therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones." And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. I mean, this is beautiful. So often we experience things in life that happen to us because we're powerless, right? We didn't have power to change the situation. Somebody hurt us and we couldn't prevent it. And the question is, what if the tables are turned? How will you treat those who mistreated you when you have power? Will you use that as an opportunity to get your eye? To take your tooth? Or maybe you will never have the opportunity to have power over somebody who hurt you. But God gives you power over somebody else. And does what you wish you could have done to them manifest itself in the way you treat somebody who can't defend themselves to you, who is at your mercy? Robert Ingersoll said this about Abraham Lincoln: "Nothing discloses real character like the use of power. It's easy for the weak to be gentle. Most people can bear adversity. But if you wish to know what a man really is, give him power." This is the supreme test. Joseph could have done anything he wanted to his brothers, and nobody would have stopped him. He could have made them pay an eye for an eye. He could have taken 2 eyes. He could have done anything he wanted. And when he had power, what he wanted to do, because God had changed his heart and broken the cycle, what he wanted to do was to care for them and comfort them and speak kindly to them. Isn't that a testimony of God's transforming grace? It is such an amazing testimony. Joseph uses his power to respond to evil with goodness. He's not going to let the cycle go down to the next generation and the next. He's going to respond like God does to evil with goodness. By the way, that's how God uses his power, isn't it? He uses his power for mercy, for goodness. Now, this isn't to say there's never boundaries or consequences. That's not what we're talking about here. But we're talking about, can we still love? Can we still forgive? And will we allow that hurt to define our character and our relationships and consume us and continue on those same patterns? Or will there be something new? Will there be a new way of relating to one another? And what I love about the story of Joseph is that Joseph is an example of Jesus. Think about it. Sold by your close companions for the price of a slave. Imprisoned. Abandoned. And ultimately, Joseph's pain and suffering resulted in deliverance for the nation. God took what was evil and he used it for good. And Jesus himself has that same heart of kindness and care and forgiveness that Joseph had. And even while they're nailing him to that cross, he says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing. Jesus uses his power for healing and for forgiveness. And ultimately, I believe that Jesus died of a broken heart so that he can heal and provide hope for the brokenhearted. 2 weeks ago, I was listening to the radio, and there was a cardiovascular surgeon who was talking about this woman whose husband had died. And a couple weeks after her husband died, she was standing there in her bedroom, and she was looking at a picture of her husband. And all of a sudden, she felt a pain in her chest, and she got short of breath. She was rushed to the hospital. She was having a heart attack. And so after they took care of her, they began doing tests. And they went and looked in her veins, her arteries. And they expected to see all the same buildup and plaque that everybody else who has a heart attack has. But it was pristine. There was no biological reason that she should have had a heart attack other than the grief she experienced for the loss of her husband. There's even a name that they give to this. Takotsubo? I don't know how to say it. Somebody. Broken heart syndrome. Broken heart syndrome. The cross, crucifixion, was designed to kill you by slow asphyxiation. As you hung there, you slowly lost the ability to pull yourself up so that you could breathe. And over the course of days or weeks, you died because you could not breathe. You asphyxiated. Jesus did not die on the cross from asphyxiation. We know this because one of the very last things he does before he dies is he cries out with a loud voice. He has breath in his lungs. And yet he dies so quickly. And I believe that spear thrust in his side, the blood and the water that comes out, is evidence that Jesus died of a broken heart. My God, why have you forsaken me? Which is hope. That God knows what it's like to experience a broken heart. And for Jesus, there's a resurrection. There's new life. There's renewal. And his brokenness and his resurrection is a promise to us that God can heal the brokenhearted and that he can redeem even our families. So let's bring our broken hearts to the only one who could truly mend them and change them.